The world spun in a blur of red and blue lights, sirens wailing through the night as I stumbled out of my car. Heart pounding, lungs burning. Glass crunched beneath my shoes as I ran toward the twisted wreckage, screaming her name into the chaos. My wife's car was mangled, metal torn open like a wound, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Paramedics shouted orders, their faces grim, as they pulled her limp body from the driver's seat. I reached for her hand, cold and slick with blood, whispering promises I wasn't sure I could keep. The hospital was a blur, white walls, antiseptic, the endless ticking of a clock. I sat in the waiting room, hands shaking, replaying every moment, every word we'd spoken that day. When the doctor finally appeared, his eyes were heavy with something I couldn't name. "She's alive," he said, "but she doesn't remember anything. Not you. Not herself. Nothing." The words hit harder than the crash itself. I stared at my wife, her eyes blank, searching my face for answers I couldn't give. In that moment, grief and fear twisted inside me, but beneath it all, a single thought took root. Maybe, just maybe, this was my chance to finally uncover the truth. Because deep down, I knew something about that crash didn't add up. And I had to find out what really happened. Before the crash, our life looked perfect from the outside. We were the couple people envied, smiling in photos, hosting dinner parties, sharing inside jokes that made others feel left out. Our home was filled with laughter, the kind that echoed through the halls and made even the darkest days seem bright. I remember the way she'd curl up beside me on the couch, her head on my shoulder, her hand finding mine without thinking. We talked about everything and nothing, making plans for the future, dreaming out loud. But even then, shadows crept in at the edges. It started with the phone calls, her voice dropping to a whisper when she answered, stepping out of the room with a tight smile. I told myself it was work, that she was just busy, but the late nights became more frequent. She'd come home exhausted, eyes rimmed red, offering excuses that never quite made sense. I tried to ignore the growing distance, convincing myself it was just a rough patch, something every couple goes through. But the silences stretched longer, and the warmth between us began to cool. Our friends noticed, too. Her best friend, Julia, started dropping hints, asking if everything was okay. My brother, Mark, pulled me aside one night, concern etched on his face. "You two seem off," he said quietly. "Is there something you're not telling me?" I brushed him off, unwilling to admit that I was just as lost as he was. Even her mother, always so perceptive, seemed to sense the shift. She'd linger after family dinners, watching us with worried eyes, her questions gentle but persistent. There were moments when I caught her staring out the window, lost in thought, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. I'd ask what was wrong, and she'd force a smile, telling me she was just tired. But I could feel her slipping away, inch by inch, day by day. The intimacy we once shared was replaced by polite conversation and careful distance, as if we were both afraid to say the wrong thing. I started to wonder if I was imagining it all, if I was just being paranoid. But then there were the secrets, the locked drawer in her desk, the sudden change in her passwords, the way she'd flinch when I reached for her phone. I tried to trust her, to believe in the woman I married, but doubt gnawed at me, relentless and sharp. Our circle of friends became a minefield of suspicion. Julia, always fiercely loyal, seemed to know more than she let on. Mark, protective and stubborn, started asking questions I couldn't answer. Even her co-worker, Daniel, began showing up at odd hours, his presence unsettling in ways I couldn't quite explain. Every interaction felt loaded, every conversation a potential clue. Despite it all, I clung to hope. I told myself we could fix things, that whatever was happening, we'd get through it together. But the night before the crash, everything came to a head. We argued, really argued, for the first time in months. Words spilled out, sharp and bitter, accusations and denials tangled together. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her, leaving me alone with my anger and confusion. Now, sitting by her hospital bed, watching her struggle to remember even my name, I can't help but replay that last fight over and over. What did we say? What did I miss? Was it just a coincidence, or was our argument somehow connected to the crash that changed everything? The questions haunt me, their answers just out of reach, as I realize that the life I thought I knew was built on secrets I'm only beginning to uncover. The days after the crash blurred together, each one marked by the sterile routine of hospital life. I tried to help her remember, showed her photos, told her stories, played her favorite songs, but nothing seemed to spark recognition. She looked at me with polite curiosity, as if I were a stranger who'd wandered into her life by mistake. The doctors said her amnesia was severe, that it might take weeks or months for her memories to return, if they ever did. I tried to stay hopeful, but every blank stare chipped away at my resolve. It was during one of those endless afternoons that I first noticed something odd in the police report. The officer's notes described the crash as a single-car accident, but the details didn't add up. The skid marks on the road suggested she'd swerved suddenly, as if to avoid something or someone. There was mention of a second set of tire tracks, but no follow-up, no explanation. When I asked the detective about it, he shrugged it off, saying it was probably nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was being overlooked. Her behavior only deepened my unease. She recoiled from certain visitors, her eyes darting nervously when Julia came to see her, her hands trembling when Mark tried to comfort her. She didn't recognize her own mother, flinching at her touch, her face clouded with confusion and fear. But it was the arrival of a stranger that truly unsettled me. He appeared one evening, just as visiting hours were ending, a tall man in a dark coat, his face shadowed, his voice low and urgent. I watched from the hallway as he leaned in close, whispering something I couldn't hear. My wife's expression shifted from confusion to terror, her body rigid, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. When I rushed in, the man was gone, leaving only the faint scent of cologne and a lingering sense of dread. My wife clung to me, her eyes wide with fear, but when I asked what he'd said, she shook her head, unable or unwilling to answer. The nurses insisted he was just a concerned friend, but I'd never seen him before and neither had anyone else. The next day, she was quieter than ever, her gaze distant, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her blanket. I tried to piece together what little I knew, but every answer led to more questions. Why did the police gloss over the evidence? Why did my wife react so strongly to certain people, even without her memories? And who was the mysterious visitor who left her so shaken? The more I searched for clarity, the more tangled everything became. But one thing was certain, someone was hiding something, and I was determined to find out what it was. I promised myself, right there in that hospital room, that I wouldn't rest until I uncovered the truth, no matter how deep I had to dig, or how many secrets I had to unearth. Determined to get answers, I threw myself into the search for the truth. I started with her phone, which had miraculously survived the crash, though the screen was shattered and the battery barely held a charge. I scrolled through her messages, but most of the recent conversations were gone, deleted, wiped clean. Only fragments remained, half-finished sentences and cryptic replies. One message from an unknown number caught my eye. "We can't keep doing this." He's starting to notice. My heart pounded as I tried to recover more. But the trail ended there, a dead end that only deepened my suspicion. I turned to our finances, combing through bank statements and credit card bills. At first, everything seemed normal, but then I noticed a series of large withdrawals, money transferred to an account I didn't recognize. The amounts were just small enough to avoid drawing attention, but together they added up to thousands. I confronted her mother, hoping for an explanation, but she just shook her head, insisting she knew nothing about it. Julia, too, seemed evasive when I pressed her about the money, her eyes darting away as she mumbled something about helping out a friend. The more I asked, the more I felt the walls closing in, as if everyone around me was keeping secrets. My brother Mark tried to help, but even he seemed uncomfortable with the direction my questions were taking. "Maybe you're reading too much into this," he said, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. I started to wonder if I could trust anyone at all. Every conversation felt like a test, every answer a potential lie. I replayed the days before the crash in my mind, searching for clues I might have missed. The late-night phone calls, the sudden arguments, the way she'd flinch when I mentioned certain names. It all seemed connected, but I couldn't see how. Her amnesia made everything harder. She couldn't remember the details I needed, who she'd been talking to, where the money had gone, why she'd been so afraid. At the same time, her memory loss was a strange kind of protection. She couldn't warn anyone that I was digging, couldn't cover for anyone or hide the truth. I watched her closely, hoping for a flicker of recognition, a slip of the tongue, but she remained lost, adrift in a sea of confusion. One afternoon, I found her sitting by the window, staring out at the parking lot. She looked so small, so vulnerable, and for a moment my anger faded, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. I sat beside her, taking her hand in mine. "Do you remember anything?" I asked gently. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I want to, but it's all just gone." I squeezed her hand, promising her that I'd figure it out, that I wouldn't let anyone hurt her again. But the more I uncovered, the more dangerous everything felt. I started receiving anonymous texts warning me to stop asking questions. My car was keyed in the hospital parking lot, a silent threat I couldn't ignore. Julia stopped visiting, claiming she was too busy with work, but I saw her car parked outside late at night, headlights off, engine running. Mark grew distant, his calls less frequent, his answers clipped. Even the nurses seemed wary, their smiles forced, their eyes flickering with something like fear. I began to feel like a stranger in my own life, surrounded by people I couldn't trust. The only person I could rely on was the woman who no longer knew me. I spent hours searching her belongings, desperate for anything that might explain what was happening. I found a stack of old letters, most of them innocent, but one stood out, a note tucked inside a book, written in her handwriting, but addressed to someone I didn't recognize. The message was short, almost frantic. "I can't do this anymore. He's getting too close. We need to end it before it's too late." My hand shook as I read the words, the implications crashing over me like a wave. Who was she writing to? What was she trying to end? And most importantly, what had she been so afraid of? The note was a puzzle piece, a hint of betrayal that made my blood run cold. I stared at the paper, heart racing, realizing that everything I thought I knew about my wife and the people closest to us might be a lie. The note burned a hole in my pocket as I paced the hospital corridors, rehearsing what I would say. I couldn't keep circling around the truth, not when the evidence was staring me in the face. I called Julia, my voice shaking with anger and fear, and told her to meet me in the hospital's empty family lounge. She arrived, eyes wary, arms crossed defensively. I didn't waste time. I showed her the note, watched her face pale, and demanded answers. At first, she tried to deny everything, but the cracks in her composure widened with every question. Finally, her voice broke. She admitted she and my wife had been hiding something from me, something that started as a secret loan, but spiraled into a desperate attempt to cover up financial trouble. Julia confessed that she'd been the one sending the late-night messages, urging my wife to keep quiet, terrified that I'd find out about the money. But there was more. Julia's voice trembled as she revealed that on the night of the crash, she'd followed my wife, hoping to confront her and end the lies. She never meant for things to go so far. My anger flared, but beneath it was a cold, hollow ache. I pressed her for details about the crash, about the mysterious man who'd visited the hospital. Julia hesitated, then admitted she'd seen him before. He was someone from my wife's past, a shadow she'd tried to outrun. The confrontation grew heated, voices rising, old wounds torn open. Julia accused me of being blind, of ignoring my wife's pain, while I accused her of betrayal, of putting us all in danger. Unbeknownst to us, my wife had wandered into the hallway, drawn by the sound of our argument. She stood just outside the door, her face pale, eyes wide with confusion. As Julia's words echoed through the room, something shifted in my wife's expression, a flicker of recognition, a memory struggling to break through the fog. She pressed her hands to her temples, breathing hard, fragments of the past flashing behind her eyes. Suddenly, she gasped, stumbling forward. The car, someone was following me, she whispered, her voice trembling. Julia and I froze, turning to her in shock. She clutched the back of a chair, her knuckles white, eyes filling with tears. I remember headlights in the mirror, getting scared, trying to call someone. I think I was trying to warn you. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over us. It wasn't the whole truth, not yet, but it was enough to change everything. My wife's memory was beginning to return, piece by painful piece, and with it came the possibility of finally understanding what had really happened that night. I reached for her, hope and dread warring inside me, knowing that the answers we needed were finally within reach, but also fearing what those answers might reveal. I knew there was no turning back. The time for secrets was over. I called everyone involved, Julia, Mark, my wife's mother, and even Daniel, the co-worker who always seemed to be lurking on the edges. I told them to meet in the hospital's private conference room, making it clear that I wouldn't take no for an answer. The air was thick with tension as they filed in, each one carrying their own guilt, fear, or resentment. My wife sat beside me, her hands trembling, her eyes darting from face to face as if searching for something familiar. I started with the evidence, the deleted messages, the financial transfers, the note I'd found. I laid it all out, piece by piece, watching as the color drained from Julia's face and Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mark looked stunned, his jaw clenched, while my wife's mother simply stared at the table, her lips pressed into a thin line. I demanded the truth, my voice shaking with anger and exhaustion. No more lies. I want to know what really happened the night of the crash. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Julia broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. She admitted to the financial mess, to the desperate choices that had spiraled out of control. She confessed to following my wife that night, hoping to confront her and force her to come clean. But she swore she never meant for anyone to get hurt. Daniel, his face pale, finally spoke up. He revealed that he'd been helping Julia cover up the missing money, afraid of losing his job and his reputation. He'd been the one sending the anonymous texts, trying to scare me off the trail. But it was my wife's mother who delivered the final blow. Her voice was cold, almost detached, as she explained how she discovered the financial irregularities and threatened to expose Julia unless she paid back the money. She'd confronted my wife, demanding answers, and when my wife refused to betray her friend, she'd threatened to go to the police. The pressure had been unbearable, and my wife had tried to escape it all by driving away that night, desperate for space and clarity. As the truth unraveled, my wife sat frozen, her breathing shallow, her eyes unfocused. Suddenly, she let out a strangled cry, clutching her head as memories came rushing back in a torrent. She remembered the headlights in her rearview mirror, the fear that gripped her as she realized she was being followed. She remembered Julia's car swerving behind her, the blinding panic as she tried to call me, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial. She remembered the moment she lost control, the world spinning as her car careened off the road. But there was more. Through tears, she recalled the mysterious man who'd visited her in the hospital. He was an old acquaintance, someone she'd once trusted, who'd gotten involved in Julia's financial scheme. He'd come to warn her to keep quiet, to make sure she didn't remember too much. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She'd been manipulated, threatened, and ultimately left to suffer alone. The room erupted in chaos. Julia sobbed, begging for forgiveness, while Daniel hung his head in shame. My wife's mother tried to justify her actions, insisting she'd only wanted to protect the family. Mark stood in stunned silence, struggling to process the depth of the betrayal. I felt a strange sense of relief and devastation all at once. The truth was finally out, but it had come at a terrible cost. My wife turned to me, her eyes filled with pain and regret. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I was scared. I didn't know who to trust. I just wanted it all to stop." I took her hand, my own heart breaking, and told her that none of this was her fault. She'd been caught in a web of lies spun by the people she loved most. As the dust settled, the question of justice hung in the air. Julia and Daniel faced the possibility of criminal charges for their part in the financial scheme. My wife's mother's reputation was in ruins, her relationships with all of us shattered. The police were called, statements were taken, and the investigation reopened with new evidence. But even as the authorities took over, I knew that true justice would be harder to find. The wounds left by betrayal ran deep, and forgiveness would not come easily. The room emptied, leaving my wife and me alone. She leaned into me, exhausted and fragile, but finally free from the burden of secrets. I held her close, unsure of what the future would hold. The fate of those who had hurt us was uncertain. Would they face the consequences of their actions, or find a way to escape once again? The answer hung in the balance, a final question that only time would resolve. In the weeks that followed, the truth rippled through our lives like an aftershock. Julia and Daniel were both charged with fraud. Their names splashed across local headlines. Julia's tearful apologies echoed in my mind, but the damage was done. Her friendship with my wife was shattered, and the trust we'd once shared was gone. My wife's mother retreated from the family, her pride and reputation in tatters, unable to face the consequences of her choices. Mark tried to be supportive, but even he struggled to process the depth of what had happened, his faith in those closest to us shaken. For my wife and me, the path forward was uncertain. Her memories returned in fragments, some sharp and painful, others blurred by trauma. We spent long nights talking, sifting through the past, trying to make sense of what we'd lost and what we still had. There were moments of anger, of grief, of overwhelming sadness for the life we thought we knew. But there were also moments of hope, quiet mornings spent together, tentative laughter, the slow rebuilding of trust. We learned that healing wasn't a straight line. Some days, the weight of betrayal felt unbearable, and forgiveness seemed impossible. Other days, we found comfort in each other, in the simple act of holding hands or sharing a meal. We made a choice, day after day, to keep moving forward, even when it hurt. The scars would always be there, reminders of what we'd endured, but they didn't have to define us. As the legal proceedings dragged on and the gossip faded, we began to reclaim our lives, piece by fragile piece. We talked about the future, about what it meant to truly forgive, not just others, but ourselves. The question lingered between us, unspoken but ever present. Can love survive such deep betrayal? What does forgiveness look like after justice has been served? We didn't have all the answers, but we were willing to find them together, one step at a time. Months have passed, and life has settled into a quieter rhythm. Our home feels different now, less perfect, perhaps, but more honest. We've learned to live with the scars, to accept that some wounds never fully heal, but can still become part of who we are. My wife and I have rebuilt our trust, not by forgetting the past, but by facing it together, day after day. We laugh more easily now, grateful for the small moments we once took for granted. The pain hasn't disappeared, but it no longer defines us. Looking back, I see how loss forced us to confront truths we might have otherwise ignored. Justice came at a cost, but it also brought clarity, a chance to start over, to choose each other again. We are not the same people we were before the crash, and maybe that's a good thing. In the end, memory is both a burden and a gift, and the courage to seek the truth is what sets us free. Moving forward, we carry hope, resilience, and the quiet strength that comes from surviving together.